In 1954, psychiatrists Corbett H. Thigpen and Harvey M. Cleckley published a report documenting the treatment of a patient with a rare diagnosis. For the sake of anonymity, they dubbed the patient Eve White. She was a 25-year-old married woman who had been referred to the doctors because of severe blinding headaches and occasional blackouts. At first, Eve seemed like an ordinary case with commonplace symptoms and a relatively complex but familiar constellation of marital conflicts and personal frustrations. Then one day, the pair received a letter from Eve. Most of the letter addressed something they had discussed in a recent session, but at the end of the page was a strange message in an unfamiliar penmanship. "Baby, please," it said. "Be quite dear, Lord. Don't let me lose patience with her. She's too sweet and innocent, and my self-control." When asked about the letter in their next session, Eve said she remembered starting it, but that she hadn't finished writing it and didn't remember sending it. Suddenly, as if seized by a sudden pain, she put both hands to her head. After a tense moment of silence, her hands dropped. There was a quick, reckless smile, and in a bright voice that sparkled, she said, "Hi there, Doc." The demure and constrained posture of Eve White had melted into buoyant repose. A new voice, a new countenance, 1,000 minute alterations of manner, gesture, expression, posture, of nuances in reflex or instinctive reaction, of glance, of eyebrow tilting, and eye movement, all argued that this could only be another woman. In fact, it was. This was Eve Black, an alternate personality, or alter, of Eve White's, and the sender of the letter. Thigpen and Cleckley diagnosed Eve with dissociative identity disorder, then known as multiple personality disorder, and after working with her for several years, published their findings in a book, The Three Faces of Eve, in 1956. The rights to the book were quickly snapped up by 20th Century Fox and turned into what eventually became the Academy Award-winning vehicle for Joanne Woodward. That's the story I'm going to tell today. What happened to the woman behind Eve? How did Joanne come to this role? Who was nominated alongside her that year? We'll talk about all of this and more, so sit tight for a good episode. Before we get started, I want to thank Helix Sleep for sponsoring this video. Helix Sleep makes premium mattresses and bedding that are customized to fit your needs and are conveniently shipped right to your door. It's a really super easy process from start to finish. Helix knows that everyone's different, so first things first, they made a sleep quiz to help you find the perfect mattress the first time around. I sleep on my stomach most of the time and like medium firmness, so I got the Helix Dusk, which combines memory foam and polyform for the best balance of pressure, relief, and support. After I ordered, it was shipped in a box right to the door for free. From there, it's very straightforward. You open the box, remove the plastic covering, let the mattress expand for 1 to 2 hours, and you've got a brand new mattress. I'm very impressed with it, as are the cats. And listen, I don't know how to give a better endorsement than to say that I was actually stuck in this bed for about a week straight this month with COVID, and this mattress genuinely held up and supported my body the whole time. Sitting in one place for that long can really make you feel sore generally, but I didn't need to toss and turn out of discomfort with this mattress. It really felt great, helped me get sleep, which I'm obviously very thankful for. But look, if you're worried about ordering such an important item online without texting it, don't worry, Helix has you covered. With your Helix sleep mattress, you get a 100-night sleep trial. So if you don't love it after trying it out for up to 3 months, they'll pick it up for you and give you a full refund. If you're in the market for a mattress, definitely check out Helix. Click on the link below or go to helixsleep.com/BeKindRewind for up to $200 off your Helix sleep mattress plus 2 free pillows. First things first, let's define dissociative identity disorder. According to the Cleveland Clinic, DID is a mental health condition. People with DID have 2 or more separate identities. These personalities control their behavior at different times. Each identity has its own personal history, traits, likes, and dislikes. It can lead to gaps in memory and hallucinations, or believing something is real when it isn't. DID, as a diagnosable illness, was almost unheard of in popular culture until the 1950s, when it seemingly burst into the mainstream over the course of a few years. First came Shirley Jackson's 1954 novel The Bird's Nest, in which a museum worker named Elizabeth receives threatening letters which, unbeknownst to her, she had sent to herself. As I mentioned in the introduction of this video, 1954 was also the year that doctors Thigpen and Cleckley began to publish academic articles concerning a real patient they called Eve, who lived with DID. Those articles were eventually turned into a book called The Three Faces of Eve in 1956, which detailed her treatment and the emergence of her two alters: Eve Black, a much more outgoing personality, interested in drinking, dancing, and singing out on the town, and Jane, a level-headed personality who is better able to collaborate with the doctors and articulate the root of Eve's trauma. When director Nunnally Johnson heard about this book, he immediately became interested in adapting it for the screen. The Bird's Nest had already been optioned by MGM for a film adaptation, retitled Lizzie, starring Eleanor Parker. With Eve, Johnson could capitalize on the themes that made The Bird's Nest popular, just with a different property. MGM noticed, and according to TCM, Lizzie's producers sued 20th Century Fox to postpone The Three Faces of Eve because of the similarity of their plots. Fox then decided to delay the production of their film until early 1957. It's worth noting here that the one person who probably should have been involved during this process was not. Chris Sizemore, the real patient in The Three Faces of Eve, addressed how her story became a film in her 1978 memoir, I'm Eve. Thigpen and Cleckley had not been transparent from the beginning about really anything, not their intentions to write a book, nor their negotiations with Fox to sell the rights to her story. In her account, Thigpen clearly took advantage of her ignorance about these kinds of negotiations. He never connected her with anyone at 20th Century Fox and persuaded her to sign the contract in his office without a lawyer present. She never received a signed contract back from the studio, and despite his direct involvement with the screenplay, she was not asked for input on the script or to visit the set. Now, with the Fox machine churning to get this film out as soon as possible, one question absolutely needed answering. Who would play Eve? Who had the chops, the gravitas, to convincingly play all three alters and carry the entire film on her shoulders? Joanne Woodward was not an obvious answer to that question. A student of the Actors Studio, most of her work at that point had been done on stage, notably as an understudy in Picnic, where she met her future husband Paul Newman, and on various anthology series on television. She had played supporting roles in a total of 2 films prior to Eve, Count 3 and Prey, and A Kiss Before Dying. She was not a movie star by any means, but Count 3 did land her a contract with 20th Century Fox, so she happened to be perfectly positioned just in case a great role came along. Her casting in Eve, though, was less because the studio trusted her specifically to perform this role well, and more because they couldn't find anyone who was willing to take on the challenge. According to TCM, Jennifer Jones confessed to being terrified of the part. June Allison demurred when husband Dick Powell convinced her that she would be miscast. Judy Garland briefly committed but got cold feet. And eventually, Johnson convinced Fox that a newcomer was the only option. He liked Woodward, having seen her on television, and since she was already under contract to Fox, the studio simply assigned her the role. She, like the other actresses, was terrified of the film. Photoplay noted, she'd accepted the part without reading the script, out of desperation after seeing her career languish through many months when the studio was unable to come up with anything suitable for her. She didn't look at it until she was on her way to Hollywood. And then she says, "My first reaction was to jump right off that train and go back to New York. It's hard enough to play one leading role well, but 3? It was too much. Then I decided I'll go out there and just tell them I refuse to do it." Well, she didn't, and thank God for that. The Three Faces of Eve is a strange film structurally. It begins with a PSA of sorts from Alistair Cook, of all people, who explains DID and that the story is based on an actual woman's life. It's very episodic, a kind of highlight reel of breakthroughs and setbacks in the life of Eve White, rather than a continuous plot-driven narrative. Oddly, most of it is shot in wide, which is kind of a shame because if any performance deserves its nuances to be captured in close-up, it's Joanne Woodward's here. The reviews of the film were generally okay. Coincidentally, it was often compared favorably to the much more melodramatic and exaggerated Lizzie. But the highlight of every single review was the superlative flexibility and emotional power of Joanne Woodward. What particularly struck critics was that she didn't need a visual gimmick like new hair or new makeup to indicate the emergence or arrival of an alter. Unlike Eleanor Parker's portrayal of Lizzie, which used obvious cues to differentiate personality from personality, Joanne was able to change from Mrs. White to Miss Black to Jane by employing only slight gestures and voice inflections, one critic wrote. There was never any confusion, and Joanne convinced the audience she was three people. Another wrote, only change of facial expression and outlook turned a dreary housewife into traffic-stopping whistlebait. The same little house dress, outstandingly prosaic on Eve White, became practically illegal when Eve Black wore it. It was raw acting talent, displaying a range few actors had ever employed in a single film before. Stylistically, Joanne Woodward was acting about 10 years ahead of everybody else in this film. There's an ease and improvisational quality to her delivery that reads quite advanced in comparison to her co-stars, which audiences assuredly would have been able to sense. To see how she stands out more clearly, I'd actually point you to the film she made right after Eve, No Down Payment. The film follows three married couples in the same suburban neighborhood whose lives are all unraveling and weaving in with each other. Joanne does not have a huge role in this film, but she is far and away the most captivating actor in it. The other actors seem stiff and staid in comparison, particularly the women who have that very manicured style of the 1950s. They walk stoically and perpendicular, as Joanne elegantly crashes through each scene like a tidal wave. Part of this is required of the character, who is by nature more loose. But it's also a pure stylistic display, much more akin to what Marlon Brando was doing, and indicative of a massive shift toward the acting techniques that would eventually dominate the industry. Critics also picked up on this, often characterizing her as a female Brando, a slightly rebellious type who was exciting because she took acting seriously as a practice and wasn't interested in glamour for glamour's sake, separating her from the typical Hollywood starlet stereotype. Although she wasn't interested in traditional stardom per se, this wasn't framed in a bad way that might alienate audiences. It was more like a charming quirk. It is a little bit easier, after all, to eschew glamour if you look like Joanne Woodward. For example, rather than finding the most beautiful dress by a famous designer or getting one from her studio, she bought $125 worth of fabric and made her own dress for the Oscars. The press loved this, relishing in her frugality and creativity. The New York Times said, "This intelligence might seem insignificant, even pointless, yet it speaks volumes, for it signifies an individuality and independence representative of the new generation that is beginning to make its force felt, however modestly, in reshaping the future of the movie business." Obviously, she was nominated for Best Actress, and her fellow nominees included Elizabeth Taylor in Raintree County, Deborah Kerr in Heaven Knows Mr. Allison, Anna Magnani in Wild as the Wind, and Lana Turner in Peyton Place. If Joanne Woodward was acting 10 years ahead of everybody else, Anna Magnani was 20 years ahead of everyone else. Her delivery is so naturalistic that she easily could have inserted herself into a Robert Altman film in 1976 and been fine. Wild as the Wind is the story of an Italian woman who comes to Nevada to marry a widowed rancher. This is an underrated film in my opinion, partly because it's been so hard to find for so long, but luckily it's on YouTube right now, so you can check it out, link in description. Anyway, Magnani had just won Best Actress in 1955 for The Rose Tattoo, and by this time had become a little bit of a stereotype unto herself for Americans. The nomination was greatly deserved, but the press counted her out from the beginning. Lana Turner won her sole Oscar nomination for Peyton Place, which is truly one of the most insane melodramas of the 1950s, chronicling the dramatic events that take place in the small town Maine. Sex symbols like Turner from the 1940s had a lot of problems being recognized for their work, and here she plays against type as a woman who had become perhaps a little too reserved in reaction to her sordid past. It's a very successful turn, and it's quite impressive how flawlessly she could hide away the sexual charisma she usually flaunted in her performances, but just enough so that the audience still knows it's there and aches for her to free herself from her character's rigidity. However appealing Turner was in this role, she's clearly not the lead in this film. The actual lead, Diane Varsi, was nominated in the supporting category instead, presumably because it would have been improper for a star of Turner's caliber to have been nominated in supporting at this time. When compared to some of the other performances in this category, it simply was not a role that would capture necessary attention. Elizabeth Taylor won her first Oscar nomination for Raintree County, in which she plays Susanna Drake, a Southern belle who falls for an abolitionist and tempts him away from his high school sweetheart. This sweeping melodrama sounds like it has a lot of potential on paper, but I don't think I've ever met anyone who actually enjoys it. However, Elizabeth Taylor is fantastic as usual, despite going through a lot personally from the production to the rollout of this film. It was during this production that Montgomery Clift nearly died in a car crash leaving her home. She found him and saved his life as they waited for an ambulance. Then, come Oscar season, her husband, Mike Todd, died tragically in a plane crash, which caused some to speculate that voters would give her a sympathy vote, though any sympathy she might have garnered from the collective voting body was quickly squandered the next year when news of her affair with Eddie Fisher came to light. This nomination seemed to announce and confirm Taylor's status as the kind of actors who the Academy should pay attention to in the long term, and gave a preview of the incredible performances she'd give in the next few years. But it was far from her best role to date, and failed to generate much enthusiasm. This brings us to Deborah Kerr, the Glenn Close of the 1950s, a woman who, by all means, should have won a competitive Oscar, but year after year fell short for one reason or another. Much like Close in 2017, Kerr was predicted to be the favorite for this Oscar because, well, it was about time. Although she had yet to win, she'd been nominated 3 times before, and the general consensus was that she'd likely come in second twice, in 1953 for From Here to Eternity, and in 1956 for The King and I. She was also incredibly popular. In the Film Daily's year-end Filmdom Famous Fives poll, Miss Kerr won 2 of the 5 sightings for Best Performances by Female Stars for An Affair to Remember and Heaven Knows Mr. Allison. In 1957, she and Rock Hudson won Photoplay magazine's Gold Medal Awards for the Most Popular Actors of the Year. Critics loved her too. Several predicted that she was a shoo-in for the award. She even won the New York Film Critics Circle Best Actress Award, which was generally considered the most consistent indicator for acting wins at this point. However, I don't know how many of you have seen Heaven Knows Mr. Allison, but it's not an easy performance to get excited about. It's not a bad movie, to be clear, but it's just not Deborah Kerr's movie. She plays a nun who is stranded with a Marine on a remote island during World War II, where the unlikely pair must survive Japanese occupation and each other's personalities. Kerr spends most of this movie hiding in a cave or explaining her religious vows, so it's not exactly her most exciting, dynamic, or interesting performance, especially compared to the last time she played a nun and the other film she made in 1957, An Affair to Remember. In retrospect, it's maybe not surprising that she was nominated for Heaven Knows Mr. Allison instead of the vastly more charming display that is An Affair to Remember. Films that explored the American presence in East Asia and relations with Japan were very much in vogue. 1957 saw the release of Bridge on the River Kwai and Sayonara, both of which won a heap of major awards that year. At the end of the day, as much as the timing seemed right, I think it's hard to pick that performance over something like The Three Faces of Eve. A lot of journalists chose her as the obvious winner, but most of them acknowledged that, should she not win, the award would go to Joanne Woodward. I could only find one who went as far as to say that Joanne would snatch it from Kerr outright. Journalist Helen Bauer wrote, "Again, there will be the irony of the award going to a younger woman. A new face, as it did in 1953 when Audrey Hepburn for Roman Holiday won over Miss Kerr for From Here to Eternity. Miss Kerr should have had the 1953 honor because Miss Hepburn was not called upon to create a character different to her own personality, as Miss Kerr was. And that's acting." If Miss Woodward walks off with the gold statuette, there will be rather more justice, since her performance as the Three Eves met a challenge as any actress would have considered worthy of her professional skill. That night, Joanne Woodward did indeed walk off with the gold statuette. After a short but touching speech, she told the press that she couldn't believe she'd won. She was sure she'd heard Deborah Kerr's name instead. Her win was framed as a moment of glory for youth. A new star was born, pushing the craft of acting forward with new perspectives and a brand new hot-ass husband. This set off a micro-trend at the time, with several actresses on television playing characters with DID, including Shelley Winters on Climax and an episode of Perry Mason. In the years since, Hollywood has shown it loves to give awards for performances like this. Cynthia Nixon won an Emmy for guest starring on Law & Order SVU, Toni Collette won an Emmy and Golden Globe for The United States of Terra, and perhaps most famously, Sally Field turned her entire career around with her Emmy for Sybil in 1976. On some level, it's rather instinctive why an extremely rare illness keeps appearing like this. You almost never see someone with DID written as having alters that are mostly similar to one another. They almost always have different accents, ages, and usually wildly divergent personalities. In other words, no role could more efficiently demonstrate an actor's range. How convincingly can you play a horny old Vietnam vet, a teenage rebel, and a prim and proper housewife all in the course of 1 hour? Author Robert Doak adds in his article on MPD in Popular Culture, there are several literary reasons why contemporary writers who deal with crime, espionage, and horror might be attracted to MPD. Most obviously, the disorder presents the therapist with a complex mystery, especially because patients have no awareness of what their alters do, and because patients typically demonstrate a reluctance to talk about what they know about their other selves. Often, a psychiatrist will have to unravel the story of a patient's trauma, as new alters reveal themselves and present clues. It's the unpredictability of these events that make for a compelling drama. But just because DID is appealing for entertainment purposes doesn't necessarily mean that these stories responsibly represent what living with DID is like. Actually, because DID has potential as entertainment means it's more likely to be represented poorly. For example, many of these stories frame these characters as violent. Films like M. Night Shyamalan's Split have come under criticism for this exact reason. Dr. Simone Reinders, a neuroscientist studying DID at King's College London, told The Guardian, they make it seem as if patients with DID are extremely violent and prone to do bad things. This is actually not true, and it very badly misrepresents the psychiatric disorder. This is definitely a disorder that does not need any more stigma attached to it, particularly because many people don't believe it's real to begin with. Another trope, by the way, frequently associated with the disorder, that people are faking it. This is what happens on SVU. This one got much worse after it was revealed that the real case behind Sybil may not have been telling the truth, and may have been manipulated by her doctor into maintaining the ruse. For her part, it was several decades before Sizemore watched The Three Faces of Eve. She was disappointed with the film's neat, satisfying ending, which suggested that she had overcome her illness. In reality, she continued to struggle with it. 22 personalities lived in her body, 3 at a time, for the next 46 years. She was not invited to the film's premiere in Augusta, Georgia, but absorbed every word about it in newspapers and fan magazines. In I'm Eve, she details how strange it felt to see Joanne Woodward's face attached to her story in advertisements, the cruel injustice of seeing others feted for her suffering, and how the whole affair made her feel once again like an unwanted, ugly child. It was difficult for Chris to overcome the stigma of DID, although later in life she was able to wield her knowledge for a greater purpose. According to the LA Times, she advised the FBI on multiple personality disorders, helped found an international organization dedicated to research on such problems, and lobbied state and national legislators on mental health issues. She also had a Susie and the Banshees song written about her, so that's cool. Joanne Woodward would return to the world of DID in 1976 as Sybil, this time as the psychiatrist Dr. Wilbur. The connection to her Oscar-winning role was lost on no one. Sally Field's varied and intense performance as Sybil is heralded most often in this, and rightly so, but I'd like to throw Woodward a bone here. Her performance is an essential, stabilizing presence for the miniseries, which can be hard to watch. She's warm and intelligent, a perfect proxy for the audience who seeks to ease Sybil's state of mind. The LA Times critic called it a glorious performance, perhaps the finest in her distinguished career. This video covers a unique time in Joanne Woodward's career, the brief period before she was thought of as one half of a duo, before her marriage to Paul Newman. This story changes after their Vegas marriage in 1958, and I think that's best left for another day, so it can get the space it deserves. In the meantime, I recommend the series The Last Movie Stars on HBO Max if you're in dire need of more on their relationship. I've also left a link in the description to where you can watch The Three Faces of Eve for free right now, so be sure to check it out. Thank you again to Helix for sponsoring this video. Don't forget to click on the link below or go to helixsleep.com/BeKindRewind for up to $200 off your Helix sleep mattress, plus 2 free pillows.
My question is, Mr. Grant wants me to see Mrs. Grant as a kind of a go-between. Do you think I should?
You call that a tough question? That's not a tough question. A tough question is if you and Paul Newman were stranded on a desert island and he had amnesia, would you tell him he was married to Joanne Woodward? That is a tough question.